U.S. inflation rate hits biggest since 2008, outlining the case for Bitcoin.
There's an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
The Consumer Price Index, a measure of the price of consumer goods and services, has increased by an annual rate of 5% last month, hitting its highest mark since August of 2008, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. As money printing,
there's an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve,
and federal economic stimulus measures continue in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, many fear that inflation could lead to out-of-control prices and additional problems for the U.S. government and the economy. Ben Ark, is inflation on the way? Should we be afraid? Or is this again good for Bitcoin?
No, you should be worried. No, it's the US can inflate a lot more. I mean, they really want to increase their deficit and then just not pay it back. That's the best way to handle the inflation. But if they don't want to do that, then they can just increase interest rates, and then banks will stop lending, and there'll be less money printed, and then inflation will decrease. So this is these governments can trying to control their fiat currencies. It's a balancing act between inflation and interest rate, and that they're fairly efficient at it. They're not as good as they could be at it. Soft currencies have a lot of useful functions, like you can just make more of it, for example, but more often than not that gets corrupted, and then it can be applied poorly, and ultimately if you've got some crazy dictator, then a sovereign currency producer can have runaway and hyperinflation. But I wouldn't worry for the US dollar. I would worry for maybe the euro, because you've got a whole bunch of countries who aren't sovereign currency producers, so they can't just create or as much money as they need to get themselves out of an economic crisis. They're reliant upon doing it through the euro, which is what we saw in Cyprus and all the problems they had, for example. So no, you don't need to be worried. And that, as a bunch of Bitcoiners sat waiting for hyperinflation to take hold, so hyper-Bitcoinization will happen, I think is mostly a waste of effort. We should just build better money infrastructure and make a money which works better and more natively on the internet, and then people will just use it. But yeah, I wouldn't expect the dollar to have hyperinflation anytime soon, unless they get a complete lunatic in power and they re-elect Trump maybe, and I don't know, they dissolve the Senate and whatever else you'd need to do in order to make an unstable country.
Oh, but doing it your way sounds like too much work. I'd rather just wait for the other system to fail and then assume that it would, because then I don't have to do anything, right? Dan Eve is gone. Let's go to Josh Shigala. Your thoughts on inflation?
The thing is, yes, in a vacuum, Ben is correct. You can just sort of stop, you can lift interest rates, and that means the dollar gains value as people start to pay off their loans and want to buy it off the free market and that causes more demand. The thing that the American dollar had for a long time is that other places would start to use the US dollars, especially South America, as we can see, as we talked about earlier. And this use case is kind of interesting, where you start to spread a fiat currency that is your sovereign currency, but you start to spread it to countries that just have terrible.
Looks like Dan Eve is back. Josh Shigala is frozen, or perhaps I'm frozen. Dan, your thoughts on inflation and Bitcoin?
Oh, inflation, eh? Inflation. If I was to give you an example, see, the problem is, whilst everyone's raving about the volatility of Bitcoin, they're kind of, because it just swings wildly. And fair enough, it does, but lots of things swing. But I'm not going to go down that route. Swinging is fine if you're for a couple that just want to open up avenues. Anyway, there are also other things to worry about, like inflation in general. Like a gallon of milk. Here, I'll give you two examples, two drinking examples. So 36 cents in 1913. In 2013, $3.53. and a cup of coffee, 1970, 25 cents. 2021, 2.99. So that's the cost of having an infinite amount of money in your reserves.
The amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
An infinite amount. Can we just hear that again? Because I love it.
There is an infinite amount of cash at the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. And having an infinite amount, imagine an infinite amount of anything right now off the top of your head. Goats. Just think about like problems. Like anything. Love, infinite amount of love. There's too much. Like there probably could be too much love, but just anything you can think of, an infinite amount of it is going to be bad. But ultimately, fractional reserve lending, all the sorts of stuff, the inflation of printing money, that's what's going to be the problem, and is a problem, and people should be focusing on, not the idea that that Bitcoin fluctuates a bit, because other stuff fluctuates a bit. Like there's currencies that can drop 15-20% overnight because of a random event. So obviously they're very they're black swan events, but I thought when you were talking about bailouts, I was thinking, what would happen like if the US keeps on printing money and then eventually they need a bailout? Like, who are they going to go to? And I was thinking, right, it's going to be every iPhone user who Googles stuff and buys things from Amazon. They'll be like, we need your donations. We need your money now. Otherwise, we're not going to be $1 trillion companies anymore. But inflation is bad. Like, just go and watch any documentary or like mini documentary on inflation. You're not going to find positive things. It's not like one where there's two sides of the fence, where you can argue, on both sides. Inflation.
A Keynesian can argue till the cows come home about how.
Yeah, but they don't make sense.
No, they don't. What I was just saying before, before it broke up, was that there's a whole lot of technicals happening. So you have what's called the repo market, which is basically the Fed buying stocks or borrowing, instantly giving cash and liquidity to the stock market when it's needed. And there's a whole bunch of really intricate intertwining mechanisms currently working in the modern economic system that you can't just lower interest rates or lift them. You can't just lift them. In fact, they have to go lower, because they've pumped the stock market so high that if they stop bringing this sort of liquidity into the markets, the stock market could see a massive crash, an absolutely distressed crash. And so what will happen actually is that we will go into negative interest rates. And when you see negative interest rates happening, you'll get more and more inflation, and it becomes a downward spiral because they have to chase their tail. And especially if you're on a first-term president, they want to keep their next term. So they're going to keep promises going, keep new schools, keep pumping new money, more money. It becomes this really like dog chasing its tail sort of thing. And I don't see with all these South American countries maybe heading in the same way as El Salvador, where they start to see there's other options than just the US dollar. That also dries up the use case of all this excess cash having places to go for all these countries that actually use the US dollar as a proxy. So I really feel that inflation is on its way, and it's heading quicker and quicker. And the hyperinflations that happen around the world, every single one of them happens after a stimulus. And that stimulus every single time comes after bad policy, a natural disaster, or corruption. So right now we've had a global natural disaster, or maybe it's an unnatural disaster. Maybe it was created, most likely, but whatever it is, it's a disaster, and they're stimulating their way out of it. So, and post-stimulation,
what happens post-stimulation? You have a cigarette.
I think we might have lost Josh's connection there. As Jay-Z was saying, Dan, we had so many problems. And as Jay-Z once said, we have 99 problems, but Bitcoin ain't one.